You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth this morning confirmed U.S. strikes on 4 more boats in waters near South America. The attacks happened Monday off the coast of Colombia in the eastern Pacific Ocean. Hegseth claimed, without citing evidence, the 4 vessels were known by our intelligence apparatus, this is a quote, transiting along known narco-trafficking routes and carrying narcotics. Democrats say the president is using the military to carry out extrajudicial killings. Here's Democratic Representative Adam Smith, Seattle area congressman and ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee, speaking to CBS News about previous strikes in the Caribbean last Wednesday.
If the United States military is going to use lethal force, basically, no trial, we're just going to fire the shots and kill people, you need to be 100% clear on why, what you're doing, and what it's supposed to be accomplishing. There is no clarity on that coming from the White House.
Including this week's, the strikes have killed roughly 60 people so far. Why is the U.S. military striking civilian boats off the South American coast? It's a question experts and the public alike continue to ask. Following this story is Joshua Keating, senior correspondent at Vox, covering foreign policy and world news. Joshua, thank you very much for being here today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So this appears to be the largest strike in a single day so far. What do you make of what occurred and what it says about the level of operation that we're talking about here in the Pacific and Caribbean and in the waters off of South America? What do you make of what happened today?
Well, this is clearly escalating. This is a campaign that's been going on for a few weeks now. At the same time that the U.S. has been striking these boats, I think the today's strikes brings it to 13. There's been this massive military buildup in the Caribbean. Probably the largest number of U.S. forces in the Caribbean since the Cuban Missile Crisis. This includes MQ-9 Reaper drones, about 10,000 troops. It's really sort of unprecedented in the modern era. And the question is whether this is really just a counter-narcotics operation, which, it's a big one, but that's not exactly unprecedented, or whether this is sort of the opening stages of a regime change campaign targeting the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, who the Trump administration has basically portrayed as kind of the mastermind behind the drug operation bringing narcotics into the U.S.
This is kind of an important point to make, although, it's not like Venezuela does not produce drugs. But, I mean, where does it sit in terms of the actual producer of the kind of drugs that the president, is most concerned about and the U.S. people are most concerned about, which is fentanyl? I mean, is Venezuela really sending fentanyl to the U.S. at scale?
No, and I think there's been a little confusion on this point that the president has kind of created. He has sort of specifically said in a couple of cases that these boats were carrying fentanyl, which a lot of experts are pretty doubtful on that. Most fentanyl consumed in the United States is either produced in Mexico and brought across the border or produced in the United States itself. These go-fast boats going through the Caribbean are not carrying fentanyl. That's one of the advantages of fentanyl is you don't have to do that. They're more likely carrying cocaine. That's cocaine either for use in the U.S. or for shipment on to the Africa or Europe or elsewhere. But, when it comes to the Venezuela's role in the drug trade, Venezuela is a major transshipment point for narcotics. Mostly not a producer, but cocaine that is grown elsewhere in the Andes because of the kind of chaotic political situation in Venezuela. It sort of emerged as this point where, it can be brought in and then shipped on by a boat or plane elsewhere. And, there's pretty extensive evidence that, there are high-level Venezuelan officials with ties to drug trafficking. That's not controversial. That doesn't necessarily mean the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, is himself, ordering, say, this boat is going to Trinidad at this time. It's not, this is not Pablo Escobar we're talking about here.
I think before this strike that was announced to happen on Monday, announced this morning, there was this assumption that the buildup in the Caribbean and the talk about Nicolas Maduro as a drug trafficker, Lindsey Graham on CBS on Sunday, he was saying President Trump said that he was going to brief members of Congress when he gets back from Asia about potential military operations against Venezuela and Colombia. And Graham said that there was a potential for expanding these operations from sea to land, and I support that idea. So the idea of land operations, of attacks, on Venezuelan soil being raised here, and by many experts seeing this buildup. But now we have these attacks in the Pacific. What does that tell you about the priorities here? Like, is it Venezuela and is it regime change, or do we know?
Well, I think there's an idea that attacking the drug trade will weaken the Venezuelan regime because, there's this idea. The U.S. has designated this group called del Soles, Cartel of the Suns, as a terrorist organization. I think Cartel del Soles is not really an organization. It's kind of a name people give to the senior level Venezuelan generals who've been sort of given different pieces of various illegal activities happening in the country, ranging from drug trafficking to illegal gold mining to, wildlife trafficking, all sorts of things. And I think, there's a hope that by attacking the drug trade that, many of these officials use to enrich themselves, that will weaken the regime and perhaps cause it to topple. The U.S. doesn't have a great record over the last couple decades of hoping the Venezuelan regime will fall. They've tried this various forms of pressure to bring down this government, including in Trump's first term, and it hasn't yet. But I think there's it's definitely true that criminality is kind of sewn into the fabric of this regime, and there's a hope that cutting this off will weaken it entirely. If that doesn't work, I think it's quite likely we could see operations on land in Venezuela. President Trump has said he's considering strikes on land. He's issued a finding, which basically gives the CIA authority to carry out operations in Venezuela. And, there's one member of Congress, Mario Diaz-Balart, who's been pretty outspoken on this issue, has said Venezuelan officials should think about what happened to Qasem Soleimani, who's the Iranian general who was killed by a drone strike during Trump's first term. So, I definitely wouldn't rule out, so-called kinetic action, military action happening in Venezuela. The question is whether it's going to be targeting, drug labs, airstrips, shipment points, that sort of thing, or whether they're going to start going after actual officials of the Venezuelan government, since they've basically designated Maduro as the head of a cartel, basically as a narco trafficker. In theory, according to their legal rationale, he'd be a legitimate target.
Joshua Keating is a senior correspondent at Vox covering foreign policy, and we're talking about the strikes in the Caribbean and the Pacific by the United States. Those strikes up to 13 now, I believe, with the announcement of 4 boats, 3 strikes that were carried out in the Eastern Pacific off the coast of Colombia yesterday. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth confirming that this morning. Joshua, what are the legal questions at play here?
Right. I mean, so this is not an officially declared war, and normally, when you just sort of kill people without trial outside of a war, that's considered murder. In this case, the Trump administration hasn't really laid out a detailed legal rationale, but they've made the case that bringing drugs into the U.S. Basically constitutes a form of armed aggression. And they've used the phrase narco-terrorism, and they've designated both several high-ranking members of the Venezuelan government and, this gang Tren de Aragua, which sort of originated in Venezuela, and now there's a lot of members in the U.S. They've designated these as terrorist groups. So, I think what we're seeing is a kind of blurring of the lines between what's traditionally considered a law enforcement question, preventing drugs from entering the U.S., and what's traditionally considered a military question, things like, uh, carrying out strikes against suspected terrorists. And, I think you can sort of see an escalation from the kind of legal logic of the war on terror, and the sort of drone strikes that were carried out under several administrations against groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to these operations we're seeing today. The difference was, even in those cases, the Obama administration, for instance, um, came up with pretty detailed legal rationales to justify its drone strikes on terrorist targets. People had problems with those rationales. They were disputed. This affected a lot of litigation happened in the courts over them. But, the Trump administration has been pretty vague about why it considers what it's doing to be legal and not just extrajudicial killing.
It links to the rationale for using the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelan folks without any, trial or hearing to a prison in El Salvador, for example. Something that the courts have largely blocked, have been involved in. But all of this is of a piece, this idea that there's kind of a blurring of the lines about who is an enemy combatant and where the like rules of war start to play in. And in this case, even on American soil, when we're talking about deporting people to a prison in El Salvador without hearing, but in the cases of these attacks, strikes where we haven't seen any justification or evidence offered. I mean, one of the things that strikes me, Joshua, is the survivors of these attacks and whether or not they've been able to speak out and say what's actually going on here. I mean, obviously drug traffickers are not going to raise their hands and say, yes, I'm a drug trafficker. But has there been any evidence from the survivors or testimony from the survivors of what they say was occurring?
Not really yet. I mean, there was a case, one of the survivors who was deported to Ecuador, the country he came from, was actually released because the Ecuadorian court system couldn't find evidence to try him. I mean, most likely the people on these boats, assuming these are actually drug trafficking boats, and there hasn't been all that much evidence presented, but if we take the administration at their word that they do have conclusive evidence of this, I mean, these are probably pretty low-level people doing it for money. It's not as if these are sort of high-level operatives in the drug cartel who would, being and this is not Qasem Soleimani. These are not people who, if you sort of take them out, will have a sort of major impact on the overall operation of these drug cartels.
What is next here? I mean, I mentioned that Congressman Adam Smith, Seattle area ranking member on the Armed Services Committee, it has been asking for hearings. Is there anything that at this point Democrats who are in the minority in Congress who want to look into this can do? And is there any, I suppose Rand Paul is one member of Congress, senator who has made noises that he doesn't like the use of the military in this fashion and in these strikes. I mean, do you see any role for oversight going forward and on how these are being conducted?
Yeah, I mean, I was struck this week seeing Senator James Langford, Republican from Oklahoma, said that, the administration really needs to give more insight into what he's doing, and actually said that if the Biden administration had been doing something like this, he'd be apoplectic, and he and his Republican colleagues would be sort of demanding answers. You know, I I I don't expect to see that much oversight, and honestly, the international reaction has been more muted than you'd expect. And an exception to that is Colombia's president, who's been very strongly criticizing this, and as a result, saw himself placed under sanctions. But I think that drug traffickers are never particularly popular among either the U.S. public or among other governments in the region. And there are also a lot of governments that wouldn't be too sorry to see Maduro gone. On the other hand, I think this changes if it becomes just sort of a blatant regime change operation. I think given the history of the U.S. in Latin America, a lot of governments would be very uncomfortable with the U.S. sort of taking extensive military action on land in a Latin American country or even overthrowing its government. And I think a lot of places would have to be wondering if they're going to be next. The precedent that people are citing for what could happen if the U.S. starts taking action in Venezuela itself against the Maduro regime is the 1990 U.S. invasion of Panama, which saw the arrest of that country's military dictator, Manuel Noriega, who similarly to Maduro had been indicted in the U.S. on drug trafficking charges. Of course, it's a much smaller country. The U.S. had a lot more sort of assets in the Panama Canal at the time. It was, there are a lot of reasons why that precedent doesn't quite work. But, I mean, when you look at the Trump administration's foreign policy, clearly they've been willing to use force in a number of occasions, whether it's against the Houthis in Yemen, whether it's bombing Iran's nuclear program, if you go back to the Syria in the first term. But, Trump tends to look for easy wins, for sort of quick operations that won't get the U.S. bogged down. I think there's tremendous risk if the U.S. is actually like putting boots on the ground in Venezuela of this turning into a much larger operation. So I think the question going forward of how far he's going to take this is whether how easy and clean he can be convinced that it will be to sort of take action against the Venezuelan government.
Joshua Keating is a senior correspondent at Vox covering foreign policy and world news. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. And hey, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.